President, today, the President of the United States unveiled the last budget of his presidency, $4.1 trillion. Of that $1.1 trillion is discretionary spending. That's the amount that Congress will then discuss over the next few months. It's no big secret that presidential budgets typically are dead on arrival. This one's especially so. Obviously, it's the last one of the president's term. It's required by the 1974 Budget Act that the president turns in this budget by the first Monday of February. It's actually now into the second week. It's a week late, but hey, it's closer to on time than other presidents' budgets have been in the last few years. A lot of wish list items that are in the president's budget. It also includes about $3.4 trillion in new taxes over the next 10 years. It increases spending by $2.5 trillion over the next 10 years, including next year. The challenge is, in the president's spending plan, it increases spending so much that we also continue to increase the deficit, the debt, and our interest payments. This body should realize that on current track, the Congressional Budget Office and the president's budget that he released today forecast that within the next 10 years, the United States of America will spend more on interest on our debt than we spend on national defense. Now, I want everyone to soak that in. Within 10 years, the federal taxpayer will spend more on interest on our debt payments, than we spend on national defense. When the president came into office, there was $10.6 trillion in total debt. The president's budget lays out a plan that by the end of his budget, there will be $27.4 trillion in total debt. This is an issue for us, and it continues to accelerate. And until this body, and until the House, and until a White House agrees this is a problem, it will not be solved. Now, I don't say this flippantly. The president and I have had this conversation. He does not believe that increasing deficits, that is overspending what we bring in, is a problem. He believes, as he has shared with me and with the American people publicly, that if the government overspends a little bit, that stimulates the economy. Well, that might be true in some economic formula. But when our interest payments are larger than total what we spend for defense, we're in a spiral that we cannot sustain. We cannot keep saying we'll add more debt every year, and there is no reckoning for that. Our total debt right now exceeds our gross domestic product. Literally, if you took from every single American in the entire country all of their income for the entire year, we could not pay off our debt. We are very much at a tipping point. And the problem that Congress faces is Congress never seems to act until they have to. And in this time, in an economic crisis, when you have to, it's too late. How do we get on top of that? How do we stop bragging about how much the deficit has been cut and actually start reducing our debt? Because for many Americans, they don't hear the differences between that because they don't live in this world of all these different terms. Deficit is how much you overspend in any one year. Debt is the accumulation of all those deficits. And as Washington continues to talk about, you know what, in the last 6 years, we've cut the deficit by $1 trillion. Well, that's a good thing, but the problem is, in the last 10 years, the debt has also doubled, as deficits are still so large every single year that there's a problem. So what do we do with this? I would say there's multiple things. One is we're not going to get out of this in any one time period. This body needs to understand this is not a car payment we're paying off. This is a really big jumbo mortgage. We're not going to pay this off in 1 year, and we're not going to fix it all in one stroke. This is going to take multiple years of picking away at this. I have reminded several of my colleagues of this one sobering fact. If we were to balance our budget and set this 10-year time period and actually balance the budget, if the next year after our balanced budget, we had a $50 billion surplus. $50 billion. If we had a $50 billion surplus as a nation, it would take 460 years in a row of $50 billion surpluses to pay off our debt. twice as long as we've been a country, if we had a $50 billion surplus every year, we could pay off our debt. At some point, we have to admit this is a really big issue. CBO is continuing to rattle our cage. That's the Congressional Budget Office, as all of us know in this room. CBO is continuing to rattle us and remind us that this debt is continuing to grow, and we do not have the resources to do it. For the first time since 2009, our deficit will rise again next year to $544 billion. That's up 24% from just this last fiscal year. As we continue to have more individuals that retire and they use Medicare and they use Social Security that they've set aside their entire life to go into, as that number continues to rise and as discretionary spending continues to stay fairly capped, we're not getting on top of the big issues that we face. So where do we go from here? Let me just mention a couple things. One is in 1974, this Congress created something called the Congressional Budget Act that set out the process of how we would actually do our budget every year. It set this very interesting process with the House and the Senate passing budgets, putting them together, going through the process, getting from the president. All the timing, everything was set up. Appropriation bills, how they would be done, all the deadlines. The interesting thing is, since 1979, the Congressional Budget Act and the way that it was set up, since 1979, it's only worked 2 times. Twice since 1979. Would anyone else admit that there's a problem with how this is set up? Coming out of Watergate in 1974, they wanted more transparency. They wanted this open process. They wanted a way to be able to do the budget, and so they created this process that is so cumbersome that since 79, it's only worked twice. To give you some more up-to-date details, in the last 10 years, we should have passed 118 appropriation bills in the last 10 years. We have passed, of that 118 appropriation bills, only 7 of those individual bills on time. 7 of 118. We have a problem just in basic process. So let me just throw a few ideas out at us that I would recommend to this body that we consider. Because if we're going to fix our debt and our deficit, we also need to look at the process of how we actually do budgeting and fix this. So here are a few thoughts. Biannual budgeting. That we don't do a budget every year, we do a budget every 2 years. We're dealing with trillions of dollars. We should at least do a little bit of advanced planning, don't you think? We should be able to do that 2 years in advance to be able to lay out how we're going to actually do the spending and do biennial budgeting. Now, we could do appropriations every single year to be able to provide the accountability. But at least the major budget process, we should do every 2. We should get rid of the budget gimmicks that dominate this body and how we quote unquote balance our budget. Budget gimmicks like pension smoothing, corporate timing shifts, and all of our favorite chimps, changes in mandatory programs, which everyone outside of this city thinks is a monkey, and everyone inside of this city know it's actually just a great budgeting technique. Here's how some of those work. Here's an example from October's budget agreement. The pension payment acceleration in Section 502 changed the due date for pension premiums from October the 15th, 2025 to September the 15th, 2025 in order to get $2.3 billion into the 10-year window. Now, what just changed there? They moved the payment time 30 days forward and said that's when it's due. And so since they moved it 30 days forward, 10 years from now suddenly that's another $2 billion into the federal budget. Now, if our federal budget wasn't 10 years, it was 10 years and 2 weeks, it would have been $2 billion short. But because they moved that payment over a month and made it a little bit earlier, it suddenly picks up $2 billion. It's not real. That's a gimmick. The changes in mandatory programs that go out there. Take something like the Crime Victims Protection Fund, a fund of money that is expected we will spend that fund of money, but when we actually don't spend part of it, they'll say, great, well, we can take that part we were quote unquote expected to spend and actually spend it this year, and then guess what? Next year you spend it again, next year you spend it again. It's a gimmick that should be struck. We shouldn't have little gimmicks like that. Those things make Congress look good, but don't actually deal with our deficit and our debt. They're rules that are internal, that need to be fixed. We need to get real numbers and to be able to have agreeable real numbers. Right now, there's the big argument all the time saying, how does the budget balance against the president's budget? This particular baseline, that particular baseline. To have an agreed upon set of numbers that we can go with. How about this? We have a lot of programs that have not been authorized, some of them in more than a decade, but we continue to allocate money for every single year. Authorizing programs as we do for national defense every single year is important for us to actually do the work of that, to be able to bring bills to the floor and to be able to get it done. We have reports from the GAO and from the IG that come out every year showing waste, yet many of those, no one ever acts on. 3 different folks that I see on the floor here right now, Senator Flake from Arizona, Senator McCain from Arizona, and my office, all put out waste reports in the past 5 months, detailing billions of dollars in waste. We can identify these things. The Inspector General's office can identify these things. The GAO can identify these areas. We need to set a process in place that actually solves those things. And we can do more than talk about it. We can move it from just a messaging moment to solutions on our debt and our deficit. I've recommended things like the Government Shutdown Prevention Act to say we don't have the government shutdowns. Now, I understand some are very romantic about government shutdowns and what they would accomplish. Government shutdowns always cost more money to the taxpayer than is saved, always. And they cause a tremendous amount of turmoil in the federal workforce in multiple places. There's an easier way for us to handle this. Congress only acts when we have to. When we have a government shutdown, suddenly we have to. How about we do something very simple and straightforward? We put in place, if we get to the end of a budget year, at the end of that budget year, if we do not have a budget in place and do not have a proper appropriations done, we have a short-term continuing resolution for 30 days that automatically goes in place, and all legislative offices and the executive office of the White House get a funding haircut immediately to create the incentive that we need to act. If 30 days later we still don't have the appropriations done, the executive office of the White House, the House and the Senate get another haircut and continue to press. There are ways that we can add the pressure to us that don't actually damage what's happening in the rest of the nation. Why don't we do those things? Why don't we pass some things like a balanced budget amendment that we've talked about forever, that we voted on in 2011 has not come up again? We will never get to some of these things until Congress is compelled to do the right thing. So let's put some process in place, beginning with our budget process and real reform of how we do the budget and real structural changes here to actually push this body to do what everyone outside this body says needs to be done. In the days ahead, when we're spending more on interest than we are on national defense, this body should hang its head in shame. But before that occurs, we should fix it so that never happens. And we can get on top of our debt and our deficit with a straightforward process that actually gets us back to work. And with that, Mr. President, I yield back.